Ladies and gentlemen, as you're taking out your notebooks, what we are going to be doing is taking the information that you got with all those presentations that we went through and sort of boiling it down to some main ideas. When you compare and contrast, what do you need to do? Anybody ever? How many people here have ever compared and contrasted before? Raise your hand. Nobody? Hands, where do they need to be if you're raising your hands? Okay. When you compare and contrast, you're pointing out similarities between things, and when you're and you're also pointing out things that are different. Now, when you do this, you want to point out specific things. For example, you don't want to say it's cold in the north and not in the south. Is that really giving you any information about the south? If you just say it's cold in the north and not in the south. It's not really giving you much detail about the south. What would be a better way of comparing and contrasting north and south like that in terms of temperature? What would be a better way of doing it? Instead of just saying it's cold in the north, not in the south. Any ideas? None? Mm-hmm. Give it a shot. Okay, instead of just saying it's not in the south, describe the way it is in the south. Yeah, it's cold in the north, it's warm in the south. You notice the difference. One, you're just getting information about one region, the north. You're not really noticing or getting any information about the south. But by saying it's cold in the north and it's warm in the south, you're getting details about both of them. And that's what you do when you compare and contrast. You need to be detailed about both of those. And so, let me bring it up this way. What I'm going to have you do is get together with your regular working partners, and I want you to come up with comparisons or contrasting the north and the south. For example, the example that I just gave, which has nothing to do with our chapter, but we said it's cold in the north, then you would have to put here warm in the south. You need to include those details. You can't just say not in the south. You understand what you're doing? Think about this in terms of things like transportation. Think about it in terms of industrialization. Think of it in terms of maybe education. We covered a lot of things. We did the North economy, the North people, the South's economy, the South's people. What I want you to do is get together with your partners, and if your partner's not here, work with either the group in front or behind you, and come up with a chart showing things in the North compared with things in the South. If you write something on one side, you have to relate it on the other side. You can't just say one thing about the North and not have anything comparing it to the South. Okay? Going to give you about 5-10 minutes to work on that right now. Move your desks together and see what you can come up with. Okay, let's come together. Let's take a look and see what we have. What group has one that they like to share? Yes. Okay. In the north, she said, in the north they have good education. In the south they had uh, not so good, some poor education. What kind of education was found in the north compared to the south? Private schools in the north and charity schools in the south? Not exactly. Where did most students in the south go? Those that did go to school. Because remember, most people in the south did not go to school. What kind of school did they go to in the south? Need to look up in your notes. Go for it. Education in the south is one of the very last, if not the last, topics that was presented. If you were in the south and you actually went to school, what kind of school did you go to? I would assume that the people that gave those notes should know this information inside and out. Most that went to school in the south went to private school because the plantation owners sent them. They were rich. They could afford it. So in the south, you had basically limited private education. And so what could we say about the north? The south had limited amount of education, limited private education. What could we say about the north? You are all products of the north. What kind of education did they have? They had public education, but if you say limited, that means most people in the north didn't go to school. Most people in the north went to school. So we could say something like we had good public education in the north. And if you don't have these down, add them to your list. What is another thing that we could add? Something else. Okay, so in the north we could use that I word. What was that I word? Meaning that they had a lot of factories. Okay, we had industrialization, so excuse me. We can say that it was industrialized, meaning many factories. While in the south, as was stated over here, it was mainly agricultural. And what did they primarily have in the south? If we talked about factories in the north, in the south we had cotton that was grown on what? Plantations, yeah. We have plantations. Good. Anything else? Okay. In the north, they still had slavery. There was some slavery in the north, but there were very few slaves. Very few slaves. We could even put here more free Africans. While in the south, there were a lot of slaves. Yeah. There were many slaves. What else? We're going so far. What else? Okay, there's more railway in the north, less in the south. Can we get a little more detailed than that? What kind of railways were there in the north? Okay, they're 2/3 of the railway. What was the railroad network like in the north? Ah, yeah. How do I want to write that? Yeah, we had many connected railroads in the north. They were long, there were many of them, they were all connected, so you could go from the Midwest all the way to the East Coast. What can we say about the South then, comparing them? Many connected railroads compared to the South. Like, do people can come up with something to say about the Southern railroads? Zach? Okay, they were short. They only had a third. Okay. If here we said that there were many connected railroads, if we want to compare and contrast, we need to be talking similarly here. And so, okay, good. They were short, unconnected. They were short and unconnected. In other words, they might be local around a city, but that city might not connect to the next city. Or it might connect two cities, but nothing beyond that. Good. Anything else? Any other ideas? Comparing the North and the South. Think about it. We have railroads in terms of transportation. Think about it in other ways that we talked about transportation. There were other means of transportation that was talked about. Ah, yeah. The fact that in the north, they used a lot of canals, artificial waterways, but in the south, they relied mostly on natural waterways. So we could say, here we have many canals for water transport. And here, just like Kayla said, they relied on natural waterways. Waterways. Good. Any other way we could look at transportation? We have railroads, we have canals. Any other ways of talking about transportation that somebody presented on? Nothing about the mode of transportation you guys use more than those two? How many of you often use railroads? Didn't think so. How many of you often use natural waterways to get where you're going? Nope, didn't think so either. What do you use most of the time to get from point A to point B? That was talked about in the transportation section. You use locomotives? That's the engine in a choo-choo train. Do you use that? Okay. Whoop, sorry about that. Do you use trains? Trains are railroads. Okay. Roads. Roads. How can we compare the North's roads to the Southern roads? In the transportation section of your notes from chapter 15. Presentation. Who here did transportation by land? Okay. What can you tell us about the roads? Nobody can say anything about the roads? Okay? So the southern roads were very poor. They're poor roads, mostly dirt. Okay? And a very poor network of roads. The northern roads, while they were still mostly dirt, the northern roads, it was a good system of roads. The roads were good and maintained, meaning they didn't all have grass and everything growing through them. In the south, they would have lots of dirt roads and there'd be grass and everything growing through them. In the North's dirt roads are similar to the dirt roads that we have today. Okay. Something that ties along with the railroads here. Let me tell you something that maybe you didn't know. Normally, along railroad networks, along the railroad tracks, there were telegraph lines. Who can give me some information about maybe communication? Communication. That was the economy in the north section. Can anybody tell me anything about communication? Especially since I just said, wherever you had railroad lines, often you had telegraph cables. One, two, three, four. Doug? More. Okay, we had good communication because of having more telegraph lines. There's a reason why the book attempted or told you about that in the section on the north. Because the south had poor communication. The south had poor communication. Yes. What about immigration? Oh, okay, good. In the north, there were many immigrants. There were many immigrants in the north. And in the south, there were few immigrants. Because not many immigrants wanted to go to the south because the immigrants were drawn to the whats of the north. The south didn't have a lot of. What drew the immigrants to the north instead of the south? What drew the immigrants to the north instead of the south? The factories, yes. You don't have a lot of immigrants saying, I'm going to move to the south and work on a plantation. One, the South didn't want them. They had their slaves. Now there's something else that you can compare based on these. Many immigrants, few immigrants. There's something that's a result of that immigration. There's something that's a result of that immigration. Okay, there's more jobs in the factories. We have that industrialization, you're right. Take it even a step farther than that. We have a higher population. We have a high population, and then we have a lower population. There are more people in the north. There are more people in the north because that's where all the immigrants are going. And you can take that even one step further. You can take it one step further. Think about where those immigrants are going. Think about what's drawing those immigrants in. Hannah? Ah, yes. In the north, there were many big cities. Notice how you can draw that information, even though it wasn't specifically mentioned. You can follow the train of thought. There were many big cities in the north, where in the south there were few cities. There were few big cities. Because most of the people were out in the country. Remember the rural poor? Now the south had some cities. But if you compare the number of big cities in the south compared to the number of big cities in the north, there were a lot more in the north. And they were much bigger. I just gave you a hint for another one. Gave you a hint when I mentioned something. The RP. And think about what it takes in order to build factories. What does it take? What do you have to have in order to build factories? You need to have money. Where do you think most of the money was? In the north or the south? Think about it. You learned about most of the southern people, right? Where they lived, what kind of conditions, what we call them today, right? Okay. The north had the rich and the middle class. The people that owned businesses. There weren't a lot of people that owned businesses in the south because they had slaves to make everything for them on the plantation. And if they were not rich and owned a plantation, most of the people in the south were that rural poor. And what did we call the rural poor? What was the word? What did we call the rural poor? Sydney? Hillbillies, yes. Hillbillies. Hillbillies. Can I ask you about another one? Give you a clue. Give you a hint. Deals with education. In the education presentation, they gave you a word and its definition. That word starts with an L, and it is a form of the word I'm looking for. Because the South lagged behind in people being this, because most of the people in the North were this. Literacy, and so if we want to take that word literacy, which means number of people that can read or write, and turn it into an adjective to describe those people, how do we take that word literacy and make it into an adjective to describe the people? Literate, yes. Most people in the North were literate. They could read or write. Most people in the South were illiterate. They were illiterate, meaning they couldn't read or write. Now, look at all these comparisons. Look at all these. Good public education, limited education, and it was all private, focusing, remember, on the Bible and classical literature. The North was industrialized. They had factories, machines to make things. The South was agricultural. They had plantations. Few slaves, many slaves. Many connected railroads, short unconnected railroads. Many canals, relying on natural waterways. Good maintained roads, poor roads. Good communication, poor communication. Many immigrants, few immigrants. High population, low population. Many big cities, few big cities. Rich, middle class, mostly poor. Most people are literate in the North, most illiterate. When it comes time for the Civil War, where it's North versus the South, which side should win based on this information? Raise your hand if you have some idea. Which side should win based on that information? Yes. Why? Okay, you say the North because they're smarter. Any other ideas? The North because they have more people. Okay, the North because they have more money to pay for the war. The North because they have more factories to make weapons. Who? Okay, the North has more railroads, easier to ship supplies and troops for this war. Anything else? Should this be an easy war coming up or a hard war for the North to win? Based on this information. One, raise your hands up. One, if you say it should be easy for the North to win, or two, it should be difficult for the North to win based on this information. One or two. One or two. The majority of people are saying that it should be easy based on this information. The North has all the advantages. When it comes time for the war, it shouldn't be that difficult. Keep that in mind as we go forward when we talk about the war.